Hello and welcome to the second part of the lecture on grassroots capitalism. Now we're going to look at entrepreneurs and MSE growth. So some of the factors that are associated with how many entrepreneurs you have in a society and the way that small enterprises grow or don't grow. So first of all, some cross-country evidence put together by Poshka on the reading list using the Amadeus database, which covers almost all European countries, and then the Global Enterprise Monitor, which is run by the London Business School, that's been run over several decades and which covers an increasingly large number of developing country economies. So you put those together, you have a global database over many years. And these are two quite straightforward scatter graphs here, not really taking into account any other factors, just the bivariate relationship. And from the first one, we can indeed see that as per capita income increases in an economy, then that is associated with a fall in the entrepreneurship rate, and that the entrepreneurship rate is defined as the percentage of the adult population who are entrepreneurs, so starting or running their own businesses. So you can see the figures are like 0.1, 0.25, 0.3% is high. So well under 1% in any economy of the adult population are running their own business. And on average, there's a fall as per capita income increases. So more wealthy, more developed economies, a lower proportion of entrepreneurs. And looking at the number of micro enterprises, in this case from the GEM survey, you get similar figures for small, but for the micro size, looking at the number of firms which have gone over that threshold from micro into small, so over 10, as that increases, per capita income increases. So again, that's showing that larger countries with a high proportion of small firms as opposed to micro enterprise firms tend to be richer or have higher GDP per capita. So how do we explain this? Well, one of the earliest and simplest ways of thinking about why does someone become an entrepreneur is a simple model. We say, okay, people in the economy, agents in the economy, they've got to support themselves. Two main choices, so that just depend on gifts from family members. If they're going to work, they can either work themselves in a labour market, so let me go and work for somebody else and be paid a wage, or let me start my own business, whether it is agricultural or some sort of other productive business, industry or trade. So what are you going to do? Well, the idea is that in economic developments, that we generally think of that in a simplistic way as associated with higher capital, that have higher capital intensity production. So as production becomes based on higher levels of capital intensity, that means the marginal product of labour is increasing, because if when you bring a new worker in, they're working with more capital so that each worker is more productive. And if each worker is more productive, if there's any fairness in the world, that means a higher wage level. It may not be a perfect relationship, but we imply a higher wage from that. And of course, in perfect competition, MPL is the wage rate. Now, that is very good, but remembering the basic economics, if you increase the wage, that increases the opportunity cost of the alternative, which is entrepreneurship. So as wage level goes up, the cost for someone saying, I'm not going to go and work for the W I could get, instead I'm going to work on my own business, the implied cost of their time is going up, because instead of working on their own business, they could be earning that big W. So the idea is as wage goes up, fewer people decide to go into entrepreneurship because it's more expensive, foregoing a higher wage. So you have a decreasing percentage of entrepreneurs. Really dead simple, but it really fits the data well, as we've just seen. Yeah, so startups, small firms both tend to fall with growth. That's got a sort of a static picture explaining why at any particular time you make the decision. Dynamically, you can look at arguments by people like Schumpeter saying that, well, large firms, because of economies of scale and because of the lumpiness of doing buying labs and investing in equipment, the lumpiness of that means that large firms can do more proportionally research and development. So the more larger firms you get, the more innovation, knowledge grows, and productivity and knowledge about how to innovate grows. But, however, having said that, even in an advanced economy, there's still arguments that you need small firms and evidence that you need small firms. So one question we think about is, why do small firms persist? Many small firms persist even as an economy develops. Why should that be? and here they're controlling for some fixed effects but in different countries and so on. But then when you break it down into different levels of development or different World Bank categories, high income, middle income, low income, you find there that the picture changes slightly in that the coefficient on high income countries becomes negative, and not only that, becomes insignificant. So there's no evidence there really that increasing the number of entrepreneurs is increasing growth. Whereas for the middle income and the low income countries, it remains positive, and particularly significant for the low income countries. So it seems there could be a different effect, a different marginal effect from increasing the density of entrepreneurs in these three different categories. So the significant positive effects are only in those low and middle income countries. And oh, by the way, the reason we're using difference growth, so the difference from 1 year to the next, so how much growth is changing, is because that cancels out the unknown optimum level of entrepreneurship density, and just looks at differences, changes in that, to the marginal effect. Okay, now a schematic used by Prigus to try and interpret this is that you could have a situation like this, and here I think I need to get a pen. Sorry, activated the laser pointer instead. So first of all, when looking at this graph, we're not looking at the differences here, we're looking at the absolute growth effect, so we can see the optimums. And if you plot all countries together and then put a line of best fit, a regression line, you get what I showed you on the first set of scatter graphs with the real data, which is it seems that just there's a downward slope. Increasing the density of entrepreneurs is going to decrease growth. However, if you then separate it out, it looks like if these are the more developed economies, the less developed economies, so LDCs and developed economies, it seems that here there's an inverse U-shape separately for each of those two things. So there's an optimum for the DCs and an optimum for the LDCs. And here the argument is that the optimum for the DCs is lower than it is for the LDCs. So, but in each case, if you deviate from whatever the optimum is, then you're sacrificing growth. And if you put the two separate regression lines in, you can see that there's positive, quite positive for the DCs and also for the LDCs, but less positive for the LDCs. Now note that in order to have these two separate optimum levels, you don't need to have the growth rate for the developing countries higher than the least developed countries. It's just, this is not based on the real data, this is just a schematic to separate out the two groups. But then in the data, what Priga tries to do is to dig into some of the explanations that might be associated with having these different levels of optimum entrepreneurship densities. One of them is research and development. So in countries where there's a lot of research and development, he says that could then reduce the growth penalty. So if you already have a lot of research and development or research and development personnel in your country, it doesn't really matter whether they're working for big firms or whether they're working, you have lots of small firms which are fulfilling that function of finding out different markets and exploring new ways of doing things, or whether that's being done in a big company. So whether or not you have exactly the right density of entrepreneurs is not so important. Whereas if there's lower research and development, it's important to have those small firms to fulfill that function. Conversely, the availability of capital, venture capital for small businesses in developing countries, that can be quite critical and can really increase the growth penalty. If you have developing countries where there's very low availability of venture capital or financing for new firms, but you get a lot of firms starting up, probably what that indicates is that those firms are starting up really as survival ventures. They're not really going to be very dynamic growing firms. They're opening even in a time where there's not much capital around. In fact, more of them open when there's less capital around, and they're just really more about survival than growth. Whereas if you have a country where there's a developing country with a lot of capital available, and then you don't get many small firms starting up, then there's lost opportunities for growth. So, is there an optimum level in each country? Priam points out that this has been extensively studied, but extensively studied in the economics literature, much more in developed economies, particularly in the US and in Europe, in Japan. So he's doing some econometrics here, looking at these effects in terms of the density of our research and development workers, the idea about the availability of venture capital, and finds that he thinks there is a hit in terms of the lack of venture capital in some LDCs, and the effects. And the idea, and he also finds evidence that in the more developed countries, the fact that growth is not so sensitive to deviation from the optimum level of entrepreneurship is explained by the greater density of research and development workers in the economy in general. So policy lessons he's drawing from this are, okay, positive promotions of startups in developing countries, as in developing countries, a good idea to promote startups, but also you have to introduce address some of the institutional and regulatory constraints that prevent firms from growing, as well as simplistic things like providing capital. So thinking about regulatory barriers, a natural place to turn to is the World Bank's World Business Reports and the Doing Business Reports, which is published every year. So I think I've got this from the 2018 version, and they do quite simple things like, as I've put on the slide here, they count the cost, the administrative cost, and the length of time it takes to start a new business. So, for example, in 2018, to start a business in Canada, there were 2 procedures you had to go through, and it took about 1.5 days. So you've got an idea, you've got some funding, say 2 days, took 1.5 days, 2 procedures, and you've got it done. A very equivalent process in the Philippines, you have to go through 16 separate procedures to register your business, and it would take you 28 days to set the business up. That's just the comparison of those 2 studies, those 2 examples, those countries. Here you're graphing, the World Bank love these measures, so they put together a sort of composite measure looking at in the business registry or the administrative machinery in each country that registers businesses, how easy is it for another business, a member of the public, an administrator to find out exactly who owns what and who's doing what, and how easy is it if you're running a business to find out exactly all the things you have to do to comply with the law and register. And they give scores to these different factors and they call that the transparency of information. But you can see that there is some sort of fairly clear correlation here between the more transparent the information is, then the cost of starting a business is lower and the time it takes you to start a business is lower. So there's an argument in favour of increasing that general transparency and ease of access to information. A couple of other observations that you can get from this report is that I've just put transparency on here, but transparency is also highly negatively correlated with measures of corruption. So countries which score highly on the corruption index tend to score badly on this transparency score. And also there's a correlation between the cost of starting a business and some indicators of FDI, as though in countries with a high proportion of FDI in their investment mix, that tends to increase the cost of capital for local companies, for small startup venture capital, and makes it more expensive to start a business and grow a small business. So some negative spillover effects from FDI there. So that's cross-country evidence. Now, there's some really nice papers in the reading list which give you more specific case study examples from different places. And this is one I really like, is the You Win competition in Nigeria, which is a periodic competition done on a really large scale. I think these are the 2011 onwards. So this was started in 2011 and then it ran for several years afterwards. So it's widely advertised on media and press all over the country, and it advertises money for new startups and expanding firms. So both these things are covered. And what happens is that people have to submit a business idea and then gradually go through different stages, and they have to submit a whole plan, an investment plan, and a market analysis and so on. And to give you an idea of the scale of it, 24,000 applicants, 6,000 selected, and they get 50k each. Now, what the Mackenzie did in the paper was, he worked with these people and he said, okay, you've got the 6k selected, but sorry, as well as the 6,000 that are selected to win, on top of that, we take out another 729 from the ones that didn't quite get to that last stage. So what you're doing is these 24,000 are being whittled down. You get to the last stage of filtering, and the ones that didn't get into that 6,000 that almost got there, from those you randomly select 729 and they get added to the winners. And here we're running a randomized controlled trial. So they've been selected randomly. And the idea is they've all achieved a similar level of not quite getting to the final stage. So you hope there's some equivalence there, and you randomly select half of them. And the idea is then you want to be able to make an argument, because it's an RCT, there's some causal relationship between winning the competition and any positive outcomes, rather than, we might discuss in the lecture, why do they have to do that? Why not just analyse the results of the winners and see how much better they did? But among these ones that are randomly selected for the RCT, 5 years later, indeed, we can find that there rises in the number of businesses started. The ones that had survived, is a high proportion survived. The ones that already existed, sales are up, profits are up, and employments are up. And they created, from the 729, created 7,000 jobs at a cost of about $8,000 each. And the GDP is, depending on whether it's PPP or nominal, it's sort of like 2 to 5 to 6,000. So maybe this is, at most 4 years' wages, probably more like a couple of years' wages for your creating each one. But really the bottom line is what I put on the bottom line here, which is the return to capital this represents in terms of profits and output is much, much higher than local interest rates. So it shows people should be able to, if people could borrow money at local interest rates, then they would, because it would pay them to do it. So there must be some reasons why people are not able to borrow money at local interest rates and do this, because it should pay. And there have been a number of other competitions like this around the world. Okay, some more data on growth patterns, and here I'm trying to broaden it out a bit, because notice I can't go on a bit too much about sub-Saharan Africa. So this one is from an absolutely classic writer, Mead, and he works with Lidholm. I think this article's on the list. I'm sure it's on the list. And there are surveys from 9 countries in all different areas of the developing world. Actually, not Asia, Latin America, Caribbean, and sub-Saharan Africa. And a really enormous range of activities. So literally, you had people there just sitting in a bar in a market, weaving mats or baskets, and other people with quite substantial factories and industrial production. All these, of all the firms in these 9 countries, more than half of them, they're just one person shows, just the person, and in more than 3/4, it's just family. So it's either the person working there, or it's them plus another family member working for them. And in most of the countries, more than half of them are female-run micro-enterprises. So it really is that very grassroots level. In all of them, there's a definite increase in efficiency with size, as a general trend in each country. But the biggest gains are getting away from the one person to employing just two people or 2 or 4 people, and then from there, a few more people, getting up to 6 to 9, to that edge of the small category. So pushing towards the edge of that micro category, those are the biggest gains. After that, there are gains, but they're less sort of step change in those first few efficiency gains. So if you can get people to make those first few gains, that really drastically increases the total factor productivity efficiency. Some data specifically from Dominican Republic sample, looking at where did the employment gains come from. So in this table here, we're looking at these 2 different periods. So it's comparing a period when the economy was really bubbling along, 5.5% growth, to a subsequent period where it was more stagnant, hardly changing at all. And looking at where did new jobs come from in the private sector during this stage in this sector. And in both cases, quite small changes, under 2% from startups. In the buoyant region, in the buoyant time, in actual fact, there was a net loss of jobs in that sector. In the time when there was sluggish growth, there's an increased number of jobs from startups, from new firms, which again suggests these are firms which people are starting out from desperation rather than necessarily from growth-orientated incentives. Whereas the big changes are from expansion of increasing enterprises and then contraction. So when the economy is doing really well, big increases in employment from the growth of these firms, and then when it shrinks, then you're shedding net jobs there. So much more gains from surviving and growing than there are just from entries and exits in terms of new startups. Also, urban areas tend to generate more employment. Male-run firms tend to generate more employment. But overall, of all the startups, only 1% of those small and micro firms then grew into the, sorry, only 1% of the micro firms grew into the small category of over 10. And similar patterns were found in Kenya and other countries. So it seems then that in terms of what should you do, there are already a lot of startups, and often there are startups when things are not going very well and they don't have an enormous effect in terms of employment and in growth. So, and they don't. It doesn't seem that putting a lot of, it doesn't seem that availability of capital or markets is something that necessarily makes a big difference in terms of the net number of firms that get starting up, because even when times are tough, people are starting their own firms. So what Mead says is that I'm not sure if they coined this famous term gazelles, but the trick is, can you spot among that myriad of micro and small firms, can you spot the gazelles, or the ones which are a tiny proportion of the firms, but they're going to grow and make a disproportionately large contribution to job growth and economic growth, output growth. And his proportion suggests is that in poor countries, startup rates are already high. If you have scarce resources, it's not the best use necessarily, he argues, to put more resources into helping people start firms. Much better to put resources into helping people to grow firms when they're capable of growing. The trick is, how do you know which ones are capable of growing? Okay, I was trying to keep these on 20 minutes, so I've gone slightly over that. Okay, so in the next one of these, next section of the lecture, we're going to go on to look at some of the issues about business regulation and the pros and cons of being in the informal sector. But for now, thanks for watching.